They called her the bride nobody wanted, mocked when she stepped off the coach, laughed when the rancher spoke his vows. But the prairie has a way of stripping lies bare. Through storms that leveled fences and fire that blackened sky, it was her quiet strength that held a home together. And in the end, even the man who wed her as a jest learned what it means to stand humbled. The church at Dry Willow was not much. Pine boards gone gray, a bell that rang thin as a spoon on crockery, windows filmed with dust so the light came through like watered milk. Folks kept their hats on and their voices low, which in that part of the country meant they whispered loud enough to be heard anyhow. Horses stamped outside, leather creaked, and the wind went hunting the gaps in the wood, slipping a chill down every collar it could find. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Colter Hayes stood straight as a fence post at the front, hands loose at his sides like a man ready to rope something that hadn't quite broken yet. A hard season had weathered him to plain features and narrow kindnesses. His hair needed cutting, his jaw carried a day more stubble than looked proper for a church. He didn't look at the woman beside him. She wasn't much to look at, folks said when they caught sight of her, stepping from the wagon. The mail order bride. Round in the way women get round when food and worry have fought a long draw, plain as unvarnished pine, a dress from someplace back east that didn't fit the country or her bones. She carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers tied with kitchen twine, brittle and dusty, the color of last year. When she stood there by Colter, the bouquet crackled once under her grip and then held. May Callahan, the preacher said, finding her name in his book like he wasn't sure it belonged there. His mouth worked around the syllables, soft and careful, like a man setting down a delicate thing he hadn't asked to hold. Someone in the back snorted. A young cowhand, Jed Boone's boy, couldn't hold the laugh down. It came out in a choke, and another caught it, and then the rafters had themselves a time, carrying whispers and chuckles up into their dusty bones. Lorna Boone, Jed's wife, hissed between her teeth to quiet the boy. It did no good. The laughter came and went like a restless dust devil, tugging at hems and pride. May did not move. She lifted her chin a notch, as if she were sighting down a rifle, and set her eyes on a knot in the far wall, the way you do when you're trying not to sway on the back of a skittish horse. Her hands said what her face didn't. The right one tightened on that old bouquet until a stem snapped. The left one opened and closed once, a slow bellows, and went still. "Do you, Colter Hayes," the preacher said, "take this woman?" Colter's answer came quick, almost early, as though he were throwing a rope. "I do." A murmur. Somebody muttered, "Reckon he does." And there was a smothered snicker that turned the preacher's eyes to glass for a breath. "And do you, May Callahan?" "I do," she said, and if her voice shook, it did so deep where it couldn't be heard. Sheriff Amos Dillard leaned in the doorway, hat low, thumbs hooked in his belt. He'd seen fights started with less noise than what was moving through that church. He watched the woman, not the man. The man looked ready for the nearest saloon or a stretch of open country. The woman looked like a stump left by a river, roots sunk and not moving for any flood. The words were said, the book closed, and there was the business of a kiss no one asked for. Colter brushed the air somewhere near her cheek and stepped away like a horse that's decided the new bit isn't worth chewing. He reached into his vest and came up with 2 silver coins for the preacher's plate, laid them down with more clink than charity. On their way out the door, a cluster of men made a show of tipping hats and bumping shoulders. It wasn't congratulation so much as theater, the kind of show men put on when they want to be certain everyone sees them seeing. Outside, the wind had teeth. It found May's hair despite the pins, lifted a few strands that had escaped the braid, and set them to fluttering against her neck. She looked out over the hitch rail where horses shook their heads as if disagreeing with whatever had just happened in the Lord's house. The prairie beyond lay the color of old straw under a wide, hard sky. It went on the way sorrow goes on when no one asks it to stop. Coulter unknotted his reins with more care than he had given anything else that morning. Jed Boone slapped his shoulder as he passed. "Much obliged for the show, boss," Jed said, too soft for the preacher, but not for the men. Lorna smacked Jed across the knuckles with the back of her hand before he could say more. She touched May's elbow in passing, a small, embarrassed kindness, and said, "You'll be all right, honey," like a woman speaking to a skittish filly. May dipped her head, not quite a nod. Her eyes were steady and not soft. They had a wagon for her trunk, which was not large and not new. Coulter didn't lift it himself. He told one of the boys to take it. The boy grinned like a boy does when he's been given a chore that comes with a stage. He tossed the trunk into the wagon bed, with a thud that said he didn't know trunks had memories. "Reckon we get," Coulter said, not asking. He swung up into the saddle clean as a dry creek bank and took off at an easy trot that got quicker the farther he got from the church. May stood a moment longer, the bouquet still in her hand, the preacher's wife hovering like a hen, not sure whether to cluck or peck. The bouquet made a dry whisper against her skirt. She stepped up onto the wagon wheel, climbed onto the seat, and took the reins. Her boots were not made for that country. They pinched at the ankles and did that city trick of trying to look finer than the road beneath them. She set them square on the splintered board and clucked to the team. They moved off, one ear back to listen for the laugh that didn't come. Dry Willow was a scatter of buildings built to hold out weather and not much else. The Mercantile kept its porch swept. The saloon kept its steps swept only when the wind did it. There was a saddle shop where the leather hung like good-smelling grief, and a blacksmith who sang between his teeth when he hammered. The road out of town didn't so much leave as thin. May drove the wagon where the ruts ran truest and let the horses find the rest. On the way, a child stood in a doorway with his finger up his nose and his mouth open, and a woman hauled him back by the collar with a look that said, "Even the curious ought to mind their manners today." She passed the cemetery on the little rise. Pickets leaned in and out of one another like they'd grown tired of keeping order. There were names there from far places and near. A windmill turned slow to the left of them, complaining in a voice that wanted oil. She looked at none of it longer than a blink. The road asked for her hands, and her hands gave what they were asked. Coulter waited for her at the fork where the cottonwood started. He didn't turn back when she drew near. He pushed his horse into a lope, letting the distance between them stretch and narrow like it belonged to him. The cottonwoods whispered together in their leaf language and let her pass without offering shade. Past the trees the land opened again, a scoured bowl rimmed by hills, grass exposing the ground between its thin blades. The Hayes place sat small in all that bigness, a cabin set down with the idea there might be more someday if luck or money or rain came around. The barn leaned but hadn't fallen. A string of fence ran taut in places and dejected in others, as though it had been made by a man whose hope burned steady and then flickered. A line of shirts on the rope told the truth of how many men came and went on that land. They flapped against one another, flat-chested and unashamed. Coulter swung down without a word. He left her to climb from the wagon by herself. One of the boys, red-headed and long-legged, jogged to take the horses. He couldn't keep his eyes off her shoes, then her waist, then his own feet. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She stepped onto the ground, felt it through the soles the way you feel a man's mood when he isn't talking. The door stuck. She put her shoulder against it, the way you do with doors and men that would rather you stayed outside, and it gave. Inside smelled of old smoke and old boots, and something that had been cooked a long time ago and never quite left. Dust lay on the table in a skin you could write your name in. No one had. She set the bouquet on the table, considered it, and then took it up again and laid it on the sill where the light could find it and do what it could. A picture rode in the trunk, a woman in a stiff dress from a city with a river. The corners of the frame had been rubbed smooth by hands that needed something to hold. May set the picture on the shelf above the stove, out of the reach of any elbow that might go hunting the coffee tin in the dark. She stood with both hands on the shelf until the shaking ran out of her fingers. There was wood by the door. Every cabin in that country had wood by the door. It said a man might keep house well enough to make a woman unnecessary. It said men lied to themselves the same as anyone else. She knelt and built a fire with the care you give to first things. Twist of bark, kindling, one match struck along the underside of the table, because that's where men strike their matches when they won't take the time to step outside. The flame took and then settled, and the shadows on the walls changed their minds. She found a pot and scrubbed it and filled it with water that came cold from the bucket like an insult, and set it to heating. Beans in a sack, flour in a tin with someone's thumbprint in it, a heel of bacon that would give up more smell than meat. She cooked. A woman who has nothing to say has 1,000 motions ready. She found them all. When the stew began to talk to itself in small bubbles, she trimmed a ragged cuff on a shirt and threaded a needle and set to mending. The cloth was tired but not done. She set small, neat stitches, the kind that make a man say later, "I don't recall where that tore," and thank no one. She did not hum. That would come another time maybe, when the house allowed it. Light dropped out of the sky as if someone had pulled it. This country does that. There isn't much evening to speak of, just day and then the other thing. Someone laughed outside, the quick, high laugh of a boy who hadn't yet learned when to hold it. Then the murmur of men, boots scuffing, a saddle thumped against a post. She wiped her hands, smoothed her skirt, and set 2 bowls on the table. She didn't know if anyone would sit. Coulter came inside like a wind had brought him, hat in his hand, hair with a ridge where it had pressed under the crown. He looked at the bowls, and then at the fire, and then at the shirt laid out across the back of the chair. His eyes were a color that didn't have a name in that light. He nodded toward the pot, a movement more habit than manners, and took the chair that gave him a view of the door. She poured for him and then for herself, and sat by the corner, not yet standing for the head of any table. He ate like a man eats when food is a thing you put in your mouth because days are long. His spoon came up, went down, came up again. The stew was too salty, the beans a little stubborn yet. He ate all of it. When his bowl was empty, he set it back down without letting it clatter, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand as if the cloth would be too much use for that. "Who told you to do this, Dimhidnai?" he said, the words tired as the trail. "No one," May said. He squinted at the window like there were something out there needed seeing. In the pause you could hear the fire, you could hear the wind talk through the chinks, and the horses outside shifting their weight, a hoof ticking against a stone. You could hear a life beginning to turn, not fast, not loud, just the sound of a big wheel starting to move. He rose with the careful economy of a man who keeps his strength for when it's needed. The chair legs scratched the plank once and then quieted. He set his hat back on and touched the brim to the air between them. Habit or apology run so thin it had to be stretched with gestures. He stepped outside. The door shut behind him and found its old sticking place and held. May moved because there was nothing else she could do. She washed the bowls in the last of the warm water and turned them over on the table to dry. She folded the mended shirt and laid it where a man would have to see it in the morning. She took the bouquet from the sill, shook loose the dust, and set it back. Stubborn as anything in that country, the picture on the shelf watched her. She did not look back. The house had no second room for a woman to go to and think. Thinking would happen where it happened. She banked the fire to a low red and sat in the chair by it with her hands flat on her skirt. She pressed on the place where the cloth had puckered over her knee, smoothed it, pressed again. She counted her breaths to 5 and back, the way a girl does when she has been told to behave. The wind went around the corners and under the eaves, finding all the old complaints and waking them. Somewhere out on the pasture, a coyote let loose, thin as wishbone. Back at the church, the preacher was telling his wife that it had gone well enough. In the saloon, Jed Boone had his elbows on the bar and was trying to make a joke land with men who were laughing, mostly to hear themselves be men. On the road between, Lorna Boone walked home with her shawl pulled tight and thought about the way a woman stood with her chin up and her hands still. Sheriff Amos Dillard sat his chair by the stove in the jail and read the same paragraph 3 times and couldn't have said what it was about if you'd paid him cash money. Night came full and whole, without asking. May rose and found the blanket at the foot of the bed and shook out the dust. The mattress had been made for a man's bones and not a woman's dreams. She sat on the edge and unpinned her hair and watched it fall. It made a dark rope down her back, and when she reached the end of it, she held the last inch, like she was holding a thought she didn't want to let go of. Then she braided it again, quick and simple, no ribbon. She lay down without taking off her boots because the floor looked like a promise she didn't yet trust. The fire muttered itself toward sleep. The wind kept on. In the dark, her mouth shaped a prayer that didn't ask for mercy so much as weather, a break in the heat, a soft rain, the kind of small kindness a land remembers to give when it is in the mood to be generous. Outside, a horse stamped. A man's voice murmured to quiet it. The words were not clear. They don't need to be. Not that first night. It is enough to know that a house is occupied by more than ghosts. It is enough to know a woman has come and set her things down, and a table has held bowls and a fire has warmed air that had been cold too long. In the morning there would be shirts to mend, fences to see, a world to walk into as if it had not laughed a few hours before. Tonight was only the first hard piece of a long story. The bouquet on the sill kept its brittle perfume. The picture on the shelf kept its watch. May closed her eyes and did not cry. The prairie, which had seen worse shames and better jokes, shifted its great shoulder under the moon and made room. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. The sun crept higher, throwing its pale light across the dust-stained windows of the church. The clapboard walls still held the cool of the night, but heat was already waiting in the wings, promising to press down heavily before noon. The benches had filled with townsfolk, men with collars freshly brushed, women with hair pinned tighter than their tempers. May kept her chin low, fingers twisting the hem of her skirt as though she could pull herself smaller, vanish into the wood grain. She'd walked those steps alone, her boots scuffing the worn boards, no hand to steady her, no father to give her away. Only stares followed, and a titter that passed like a spark in dry grass. "Mail order bride," someone whispered near the back, and another voice, sharp with mirth, added, "Outcast." The word clung to her shoulders, heavier than the bundle she had carried across states. Coulter Briggs stood waiting by the preacher, tall as a cottonwood, his broad frame making the pulpit look smaller. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't frowned either. His face carried that plain look of men who worked the land and left their words buried in the furrows. Still, when her steps faltered near the front, his eyes caught hers just long enough to steady her. Not kindness exactly, but an anchor thrown in stormy water. The preacher cleared his throat, his voice filling the rafters. He spoke of union, of vows, of two lives bound together under God's sky. May's lips trembled as she tried to shape the words back, but they caught in her throat like dry bread. A cough rose from the pews. A man, Crow, dark coat, too fine for the setting, a scar tugging one side of his mouth, leaned forward. His voice was smooth enough to carry. "Strange bargain, ain't it?" he said to no one and everyone. "A rancher marrying what others cast aside." Laughter broke out, low and mean, bouncing off the walls. May's vision blurred, not from tears but from the kind of shame that swells until the edges of sight shrink. Her hands trembled against the bouquet, dried sage and wildflower, brittle stems snapping in her grip. Coulter didn't turn, didn't glare. He only laid his hand, rough and calloused, atop hers. The weight was steady, neither tender nor harsh, but it stilled her shaking. The preacher, uneasy but pressing on, hurried to the words that sealed the union. When it came time to kiss, Coulter gave only a nod, a touch of his hat brim, sparing her further spectacle. May felt heat burn her cheeks, not from insult but from a strange relief. He had spared her the jeer of mockery that might have followed any show of affection. The service ended. Folks rose, chatter filling the space, boots scraping on plank floor. Crow lingered, eyes cold as riverstone, as though marking her for later sport. May kept her gaze low, clutching what was left of the bouquet. Outside, the air carried dust and the faint scent of horses. Coulter offered his arm. He didn't speak, and she didn't dare refuse. Together they walked toward his wagon hitched under a cottonwood, townsfolk watching with eyes that measured and judged. May climbed into the wagon, skirts gathered against the splintered edge. Coulter took the reins, his silence neither cruel nor warm. The horses started with a jolt, pulling them away from the church and the whispers that still chased behind. For the first time in weeks, May let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The road stretched ahead, empty save for wind. She sat beside a man she didn't know, bound to him by vows spoken under strain, and wondered if silence could be safer than words. Behind them the town shrank, voices fading. Ahead lay open country, wide, uncertain, but holding a kind of space that did not laugh. The wagon wheels groaned as they found the ruts leading north, away from the town's narrow streets and into the wider country. Dust rose and drifted behind them, erasing the tracks almost as quickly as they were made. May sat with her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders tight against the endless sky. She had never seen land stretch so far, without a fence or roof to break it. It made her feel small, yet strangely unbound, as though her shame might scatter with the dust if she let it. Coulter held the reins loose but sure, shoulders broad beneath his faded shirt. He didn't fill the air with talk. The horses snorted, hooves drumming a steady rhythm that seemed to speak for him. Silence, May thought, was his language, and for now it was one she could understand. They passed mesquite and sage, the brush bending with the breeze. Once a jackrabbit darted from the shadows, sending a hawk wheeling above. May watched it climb, wings catching light, until it was just a speck against the hard blue. She envied it. Flight seemed easier than sitting beside a stranger, bound to her by law and necessity. The trail wound past dry creek beds and scattered oaks, each mile pulling them deeper into country that felt less peopled, less watchful. May's breath eased, though the memory of the church whispers clung like burrs to her mind. At noon, Coulter drew the horses to a halt near a windmill that creaked slow circles. He stepped down, boots hitting the earth with weight, and moved to unbuckle the canteen. Without a word, he handed it to her. May hesitated, the strap rough in her hands. She raised it, the water cool against her tongue, tasting faintly of iron. It was more than drink. It was offering. She looked at him, searching for judgment, but his eyes only rested on the horizon, squinting against light. They ate in silence. Bread he had packed, a strip of dried beef torn with care. May chewed slow, grateful though she said nothing. Words felt brittle, like they might break if handled. When the meal ended, Coulter brushed the crumbs from his lap, then reached into the back of the wagon. He pulled out a folded blanket and set it beside her. His hand lingered only long enough to make sure it didn't slip away in the wind. "Gets colder near sundown," he said. His voice was low, graveled like a riverbed after drought. May nodded, clutching the blanket through the sun still bore down. That single line of speech settled something in her, proof that he wasn't indifferent stone, but a man who noticed small things. They moved on. Hours stretched, the road narrowing into paths known only to him. Shadows lengthened, and the air cooled just as he'd said. May drew the blanket close, the fabric smelling faintly of wood smoke and horses. As dusk fell, the outline of buildings rose ahead. A ranch house, weathered but standing square against the plains, smoke curling faintly from a chimney. Beyond it, corrals and a barn dark against the fading sky. May's chest tightened. This place, lonely, rough-edged, without eyes of strangers, was now hers. Not by choice, but by vows, spoken and sealed. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the porch. Coulter climbed down, then offered a hand, calloused and waiting. May stared at it, uncertain. Still, she placed her palm in his, letting him steady her descent. Her boots touched the ground. The air smelled of earth cooling, of cattle not far, of cedar posts weathering in wind. For the first time since stepping off the train, May felt the quiet settle not as judgment but as possibility. She followed him toward the door, the ranch house looming plain and silent. Inside, she would learn what kind of life silence could build. The hinges gave a long, weary groan as Coulter pushed the door inward. The house smelled of pine logs burned down to embers, of leather long worn and patched, and of coffee grounds left cold in a tin pot. The room was spare but ordered, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars of beans and flour, a stove that ticked faintly with cooling iron. May stood in the doorway, blanket still clutched around her shoulders. She had expected a place more barren, perhaps. Instead, what she saw was the shape of a life lived in solitude. Each chair, each nail in the wall, spoke of someone who had endured without need for another's hand. Coulter lit a lamp, the glass globe smudged from use. Its glow stretched into corners, softening shadows. He gestured toward the table. "Sit, if you want." May lowered herself onto the chair nearest the stove. Her body was sore from the wagon, but it was the weight in her chest that pressed hardest. She folded her hands tight as though they were the only thing keeping her from unraveling. Coulter moved without hurry. He set kindling, struck a match, coaxed flame back into the stove. Soon, warmth began to seep into the room. He set a kettle on the grate, the water inside rattling as it met the heat. His silence did not crush her like the town's whispers had. Here it seemed a different sort, practical, patient, like the land itself. May's eyes wandered. On the mantel above the stove sat a single, framed photograph, its glass dulled with dust. She could not see the face clear, but the outline of a woman's bonnet was unmistakable. She looked away quickly, feeling as if she had trespassed. The kettle hissed. Coulter poured steaming water into 2 chipped mugs, one marked with a hairline crack along the rim. He set one in front of her. The smell of sage tea rose, faint and earthy. She lifted the cup, fingers warming against it. The first sip steadied her. For so long she had been given scraps, leftovers, things meant for someone else. This, though simple, was hers, offered without demand. "You'll find the room through there," Coulter said, nodding toward a narrow door. Not much, but it's yours now. May rose, hesitant. She carried the mug with her, pushing the door open. Inside was a small bed, a quilt folded neatly atop it, a window looking out toward the barn. The air smelled of cedar shavings as though someone had kept it ready, waiting. She set the mug on the sill and sat at the edge of the bed. Her throat burned, though not from the tea. For the first time since leaving home, she felt a measure of safety. Strange how it came not from words or comfort, but from the absence of both. Later, when the house grew still, she lay beneath the quilt, listening. The wind pressed against the shutters, coyotes yipped far off, and the timbers creaked as if settling deeper into earth. Somewhere in the other room, Coulter's boots thudded once, then silence. May closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easy, but it came, and when it did, it was without the echo of laughter or jeers. Only quiet, only the sense of ground beneath her that, for tonight at least, would not give way. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Morning light slid across the floorboards, pale and deliberate, as though even the sun took its time crossing that lonely stretch of country. May stirred beneath the quilt, blinking toward the window. The glass carried the thin frost of dawn. Beyond it, the barn roof was tipped in gold, and smoke curled from the stovepipe in the main room. She sat up slowly, wrapping her shawl close. For a moment she didn't move, listening. A steady rhythm reached her, wood being chopped outside, each strike sharp, even unhurried. It was a sound of work, not anger, and it filled the silence like a heartbeat. The floor was cold under her bare feet as she crossed the small room. She paused at the door, hand resting on the frame, uncertain if she should step into his space. The night had been kind in its stillness, but daylight carried questions. What place did she truly hold here? She finally opened the door. The main room smelled of coffee, fresh brewed, rich and dark. On the table, 2 tin cups sat ready, steam rising from both. She glanced toward the window and saw him through the wavering glass. Coulter stood in the yard, sleeves rolled, splitting logs with slow precision. Each motion was practiced, as though he had repeated it 1,000 mornings before this one. May moved to the table. Her hand hovered over the cup before she lifted it. The warmth traveled through her palms, then deeper, settling somewhere in her chest. She sipped, careful, the bitter edge softened by a hint of molasses. It startled her. He had thought to sweeten it. The door opened, hinges complaining, and Coulter stepped inside carrying an armful of wood. He set it by the stove, brushed sawdust from his hands. His eyes flicked once toward the table. "Coffee suit you?" he asked, voice rough from the cold. May nodded. Words rose in her throat but caught before they reached her lips. She managed only, "Yes." He gave a short nod as if that was enough. He poured himself another half-cup and stood near the stove, drinking in quiet. The space between them was not heavy. It was simply there, like the space between fence posts, measured, necessary, holding something steady. After a moment he set his cup down. "Barn needs tending. Horses don't care if it's Sunday." He spoke as though explaining the order of the earth. May looked at her hands, then back up. "I can help," she said softly, surprising herself. His gaze lingered on her, not doubtful, not unkind, just weighing. Finally, he said, "If you're set on it, wrap warm." When she stepped outside beside him, the air stung her cheeks, but it was cleaner than any she'd breathed in months. The snow had crusted along the fence lines, and the barn stood solid against the morning sky. Coulter pushed the door wide, and the smell of hay and horseflesh met them. May followed him in. The horses snorted softly, shifting in their stalls. Coulter moved with easy care, pitching hay, checking hooves. May stood back at first, then reached to stroke the flank of a chestnut mare. The animal leaned into her touch, and something inside May loosened. She whispered a wordless sound, half memory, half prayer. Coulter glanced at her, said nothing, but his eyes carried a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, that she was not as fragile as the town had named her. For the first time since her arrival, May felt a thread of belonging tug tight. Not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of one. The barn door closed against the wind, leaving only the rustle of hay and the muted breath of horses. May brushed straw from her skirt, her hand lingering on the flank of the chestnut mare. The warmth of the animal steadied her as though she'd borrowed a piece of its calm. Coulter moved down the row of stalls, silent except for the creak of leather and the scrape of his boots. May watched him for a moment, how each gesture was measured, how he checked a hoof or straightened a harness with a kind of patience that seemed stitched into him. "Here," he said finally, offering her a small tin pail. Inside, oats shifted with a soft rattle. "See if she'll take to you." May accepted it carefully. When she extended a handful to the mare, the animal dipped its head, lips brushing her palm, warm and insistent. May let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Coulter gave a quiet grunt that might have been approval. Then he turned back to his work, as though her presence there was neither surprise nor burden, simply fact. By the time they left the barn, the sun had climbed above the ridge, spilling sharp light over the snow. Their breaths rose white into the air. May drew her shawl tighter, but there was something in her chest that felt less brittle. Inside the house, Coulter set his gloves by the stove and nodded toward the hearth. "Fire'll need feeding." May crouched, added 2 small logs, arranging them so the flames caught easily. She remembered her mother's hand teaching her the same motion years ago, long before the mail order agency, long before shame had followed her across state lines. The room warmed slowly, and with it came a shift. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall, but like ground being cleared. She glanced around the cabin, the shelf with 2 plates, the kettle dented from use, the table scarred by years of meals eaten alone. It was a place built for work, not for company. Yet now it bore the faint trace of her touch. The quilt folded differently, the second coffee cup rinsed and drying by the basin. Coulter poured water from the kettle into a basin and slid it across the table. "For dishes," he said, though his tone held no command. May dipped the rag and began to clean, careful with each piece. Her hands moved steady, as though order in small things could quiet the tangle in her heart. She sensed Coulter watching once or twice, though he never spoke. When the work was done, she set the last plate aside. For a long moment neither moved. The stove ticked as it cooled. Finally May spoke, her voice no louder than the crack of ash in the fire. "I can cook supper tonight." Coulter studied her, his brow drawn, not from suspicion but from the weight of a man unaccustomed to sharing decisions. Then he gave a short nod. "If you've a mind to." It wasn't permission so much as acceptance, and that made all the difference. May lowered her eyes, but a faint warmth stirred at the edge of her mouth. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was the first trace of one she had felt in years. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of pewter. Clouds pressed low over the hills, and the smell of more snow rode the air. May stood at the small cupboard, surveying what little Coulter kept. A sack of beans, some flour, salt, a stub of dried pork. It wasn't much, but she had learned to make do with far less. She laid things out carefully, almost reverently, as though setting each item in its place might also set something inside her to rights. Her hands moved slow, practiced, remembering the rhythm of kitchens long gone, before she became a name scrawled on a contract, a bride no one wanted. Coulter came in from the barn just as she was soaking the beans in the blackened pot. His shoulders filled the doorway, dusted with snow. He stamped his boots, hung his coat on the peg. For a moment he simply watched her, as if uncertain whether this cabin of his was truly meant to hold two people instead of one. May didn't meet his eyes. She stirred the beans, added water, and moved to knead flour for bread. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the hard silence of strangers. It was softer, like a pause that made space for breath. "You've done this before," Coulter said at last, his voice low. May nodded. "When there was something to work with." She didn't explain more. He didn't press her. Instead, he drew up a chair and began repairing a bridle, the leather creaking under his strong fingers. The two of them worked in parallel, the sound of the knife cutting pork, the thump of dough on the board, the rasp of Coulter's awl through hide, small noises that wove together until they felt like one quiet rhythm. When the bread went into the Dutch oven and the beans began to simmer, the room filled with scents she hadn't smelled in too long, warm, earthy, alive. May bent close to the fire, turning the pot just so, careful not to scorch it. Coulter set down his bridle and leaned back, watching her in the glow of the flames. He didn't speak, but in the quiet curve of his jaw, there was something like respect, not the pity she had grown used to. Respect. At last, she ladled beans into 2 chipped bowls and set them on the table. The bread followed, split open, steam curling into the cold air. She hesitated, her hands trembling faintly. Cooking here felt like more than a task. It felt like a claim, however small, on a life she didn't know if she was allowed to take. Coulter pulled out a Baja chair. "Sit," he said, almost gently. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap until he bowed his head slightly and began to eat. Only then did she lift her spoon. The beans were plain but hot, and they filled more than her belly. They filled a place inside her that had been hollow for years. Neither spoke much, but when Coulter reached for the bread, he tore it cleanly in half and set the larger piece on her plate without looking at her. A simple act, done as though it was nothing at all. May blinked, staring at the bread. Her throat tightened, though she forced it down. That one gesture, more than any words, unraveled a thread of her shame. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a burden. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Inside, a woman once sold like freight, and a man who thought himself destined to solitude shared a table. The meal was plain, but the silence afterward was not empty. It was steady, alive, carrying the weight of something just beginning. The storm pressed in after supper. Snow hissed against the shutters, dry and relentless, as if the whole world outside the cabin had gone white and airless. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. The cabin seemed smaller now, the walls closer, yet warmer for the company they held. May cleared the bowls quietly, rinsing them in the tin basin. She was clumsy at first, unsure whether she was trespassing by taking the work into her hands. But Coulter did not stop her. He only set another log on the fire and lowered himself into the chair by the hearth, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he had carried this habit alone for too many years. When she set the last bowl upside down on the board, May turned to face the small room. There was only one bed, tucked against the far wall beneath a quilt, worn thin at the edges. Its presence filled her with a tension she tried not to show. Shame curled in her belly. She knew too well what men usually expected when a woman was brought inside. Coulter seemed to sense it. He stood, broad and quiet, and took 2 steps toward the bed, not to touch it, but to draw a folded wool blanket from the trunk at its foot. He crossed to the hearth, spread the blanket out on the floorboards near the fire, and dropped a pillow on top. "This'll do for me," he said simply. May blinked, uncertain she'd heard him right. Her throat tightened. He had given her the bed without asking, Without hesitation, a courtesy so plain it undid something inside her, she whispered, barely audible, "You don't have to." Coulter's gaze was steady but not sharp. "You're worn out. That bed's yours tonight." He said nothing else, only sat down on the blanket he'd claimed. May stood frozen a moment longer, then lowered herself to the edge of the bed. Her hands smoothed the quilt like she needed to test its reality. When she finally lay down, she kept her boots on, unable to shake old habits. The fire crackled, the storm rattled the shutters. Between those sounds was silence, but it wasn't the biting silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people holding their places, tentative, each aware of the other's nearness. May turned on her side, facing the wall. She didn't sleep right away. Memories pressed at her. Rough laughter, the scrape of cards on wood, her name traded like a chip in a game she had never agreed to play. The weight of shame threatened to smother her, but then she heard Coulter shift on the floor, the blanket rustling. Not once did he cross the distance to her bed. Instead, his voice came quiet through the dark. "Storm will ease by morning." It wasn't a promise, only a fact. Yet May clung to it as if it were the first promise she'd been given in years. She closed her eyes, and though sleep was shallow, it came. Coulter lay awake longer, staring into the embers. The cabin had held one chair, one bed, one life for so long. Now it held two. The firelight danced against the walls, and for the first time in years, the silence inside the cabin did not feel like exile. It felt like the beginning of something unspoken, fragile as thawing ice, but alive. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Morning came pale and brittle. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed and still. Frost clung to the window panes like lace, and the air inside the cabin was sharp enough to see your breath until Coulter stirred the fire back to life. May woke with a start, not used to the softness beneath her. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then her eyes caught the rough-hewn beams above, the smell of wood smoke and the sight of Coulter crouched near the hearth, coaxing flame out of stubborn embers. He hadn't moved to the bed in the night. His blanket was still on the floor, rumpled from where he'd turned but never crossed the distance. Something inside her loosened. She sat up slowly, the quilt sliding down her shoulders. Instinct told her to rise and make herself useful, lest kindness turn to reproach. She swung her feet to the floor, boots still on, and stood. The room swayed for a moment from weariness, but she steadied herself. Without a word, May moved to the shelf, where a sack of flowers sat open. She found a tin cup, scooped some into a bowl, and added water from the kettle Coulter had set near the fire. Her movements were hesitant at first, uncertain whether she was overstepping. But when she glanced at him, Coulter only gave a small nod and went back to the fire. She kneaded dough with hands that remembered better days. Her mother had taught her once, long ago, before life had hardened into survival. The feel of the flour and water coming together stirred something faint but human inside her. The scent of baking ash bread soon joined the wood smoke. Coulter sat back on his heels, watching without saying much. When she finished, May pulled the coarse loaf from the edge of the coals and set it on the table. She didn't look at him directly, only tore the bread in two and pushed half across to his side. Coulter accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." The words caught her off guard. No man had ever thanked her for bread before, not when she'd been forced to serve, not when she'd been treated as less than nothing. Her throat tightened, but she kept her eyes on the loaf in her hands. They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't cold. Outside, the snow glared under a sun struggling to break through the clouds. The land looked emptied, erased, waiting to be marked again by tracks of life. When the meal was done, May gathered the bowls, rinsed them with melted snow, and set them aside. She didn't wait for permission this time. The small rhythm of doing gave her ground to stand on. Coulter pulled on his coat and hat. "I'll see to the stock," he said, voice even. At the door he paused, hand on the latch, and looked back once, not at her but at the room, as if registering the shift it had taken overnight. Then he stepped out into the cold. May remained standing in the quiet cabin, staring at the door long after it shut. For the first time in years, she wasn't planning her escape or steeling herself for blows. She was just standing. The bread smell lingered in the air, and her hands still carried its warmth. She whispered to herself, not loud enough for anyone but the fire to hear, "I can still do something right." The fire crackled, the only witness. The snow held deep along the fence line, soft drifts piled against weathered posts. The morning light bounced sharp off the white, blinding at first, until May lifted a hand to shade her eyes. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, unsure if stepping outside was welcome. Yet something in her pushed her past the threshold, boots crunching into the crust of ice. Coulter was already in the corral, breaking frozen water with the back of an axe. The horses shifted uneasily, their breath steaming in the cold. May lingered near the cabin wall, arms crossed, until the sight of him struggling with the bucket drew her forward. She bent without a word, grasped the rim, and steadied it as he poured the shards of ice out. Her fingers went numb almost instantly, but she did not let go. When the bucket was free, she straightened, chest rising with a breath that stung her lungs. Coulter didn't comment. He only gave a slow nod, and they carried on, each doing what needed doing. The silence between them no longer pressed like stone. It worked like a rope taut between two hands, carrying weight but holding. The chores stretched on. May brushed snow off the hay bales, her skirts catching the frost. She found herself speaking softly to the horses, words in no particular order, just the rhythm of sound. One mare flicked an ear and pressed its head against her shoulder. The warmth startled her, but she didn't move away. By noon, the sun weakened and the cold returned sharper. Coulter set down his tools and motioned toward the cabin. May followed, her hands raw, her steps heavy, but a spark of something alive sat in her chest. Inside, she placed more wood on the fire. Coulter removed his coat and hung it over a chair, then sat at the table, rubbing his palms together. For a moment, the old weight of silence threatened to return. May looked at him across the room, unsure if she should retreat again into herself. Then Coulter spoke, low but steady. "You handle work same as anyone. No need to prove anything here." The words lodged in her like a brand pressed too close. She lowered her eyes, unsure whether to take it as kindness or pity. Yet when she lifted her gaze again, his face carried no judgment, only plain truth. That night, she slept without her boots. It was a small thing, but it felt like setting down a weapon. Morning broke without fanfare, just the slow bleeding of gray light over the hills. May woke to the sound of Coulter moving about, boots scraping the floorboards, the familiar clink of tin cups. She lay still a moment, feeling the weight of her bare feet under the blanket, the strange comfort of not being ready to run. When she stepped into the main room, Coulter was already pouring coffee. 2 cups sat on the table, steam curling into the cold air. She paused, uncertain if the second was meant for her or if it was some habit from before she came. He didn't say, just pushed the cup a little closer to her seat before sitting down. May wrapped her hands around the tin, the heat biting her fingers in a way that felt good. The taste was bitter, strong, but it filled her chest in a way no broth ever had. She drank, slow, careful. The day's work stretched before them. Coulter showed her where the feed was stored, how the harness straps should lie across the horse's shoulders. He didn't explain much. He didn't need to. She watched his hands, steady and sure, and mirrored his motions until her own fingers learned. By midday, her skirts were dusted in hay, her palms stung from rope, but she found she did not mind. The rhythm of the ranch was different from the world she'd known. Less about appearances, more about tasks that once done stayed done. While Coulter repaired a split rail, May gathered stray kindling near the woodpile. She stacked it neat, not because anyone asked, but because the order soothed her. When she returned inside later, she swept the hearth clear of ashes. Her movements were small, but each one left a mark of her being there. Coulter noticed, though he said little. That evening, as he stepped in from the cold, he paused at the doorway, eyes resting on the tidy stack of wood near the hearth. His glance shifted to May, who was mending a tear in her sleeve, with short, careful stitches. He didn't speak thanks, but he set his hat down gentler than usual, as if the cabin itself had softened. That night the fire burned longer, steadier. May sat near it, the warmth creeping into her bones, her hands still busy with needle and thread. Coulter leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching without intruding. Something in the air held easy. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of belonging. And when she set her mended sleeve aside, May reached for the cup of tea she had brewed from the small bundle of dried herbs she kept hidden in her bag. She poured a little into her own cup, then quietly filled the other, and slid it across the table toward Coulter. It was the first thing she had ever given him. Coulter stared at the cup she'd slid toward him. Steam rose from it in thin spirals, carrying a smell he didn't know, sharp, earthy, with a trace of wild sweetness. He lifted it without a word and tasted. It was different from the bite of coffee, softer on the tongue, leaving warmth that lingered in his chest. May kept her eyes on the fire, though she felt his gaze brush her. That was enough. She hadn't poured it to make a gesture large as a promise. Just something small, a way of saying she was here of her own choosing, not only because she had nowhere else to go. Outside, a wind worked across the prairie, rattling the shutters. The cabin, though plain, seemed to hold its ground against the long dark. Coulter set the cup down, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something unspoken. The next day moved in the same rhythm as before. Chores, feed, water, the steady pace of ranch life. But something in their silence had shifted. May no longer waited for direction in every small task. She began to act as though the place might trust her. She filled the water buckets before he asked, swept the porch without remark, mended not only her own clothes, but a worn strap on one of the harnesses. Coulter watched her kneel by the tack bench, her fingers firm as she stitched rawhide through leather. The light caught her hair where it escaped her scarf, and for the first time he thought, not just of her being there, but of how the ranch looked different with her in it. When he brought a load of wood in that evening, he found the table already set with 2 plates. Not much. Bread, a small stew May had worked from beans and salt pork, but the sight stopped him short. A table waiting for 2. He set the wood down quietly, almost careful not to disturb it. They ate without talk. The silence was no longer hard. It was the kind that made room. Later, as the fire dropped to coals, May sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the orange glow. She felt the day's weight, yes, but also something else, a stillness that didn't come from fear or flight. For the first time since she had stepped off the stage in that dusted town, she wasn't calculating where to run. Coulter leaned back in his chair, long legs stretched toward the hearth, cup in hand. He didn't know the words to shape what he felt, but as he sipped the last of the herb tea, he understood something simple, that her presence had begun to weave itself into the fabric of his days. The ranch was no longer just quiet ground. It was shared. The quiet they had built began to ripple when the outside world reached their door. Word traveled up from town, carried by men who had too much whiskey and too little to mind their own affairs. Coulter didn't chase gossip, but even he heard fragments when he went for salt or nails. That woman he brought out ain't proper, mail order and unwanted, sent back once already. She won't last through winter. Coulter said nothing. He bought what he needed, tipped his hat, and rode back into the hills. But silence has a way of bending under weight, and he knew May could feel it even before the words ever reached her. One evening, as wind combed down from the north, he came home to find her on the porch. She had swept it clean, then stood staring out at the distance, arms wrapped around herself. She didn't look at him when he tied off his horse. "They'll always find something," he said finally, his voice low even. "It don't matter." May didn't answer. She hadn't asked what the town whispered, yet somehow she knew. The years had taught her to read silence like print on a page. She felt shame press at her chest, not for what she had done, but for the way the world had already judged her without knowing her story. That night inside she made tea again, not for herself, for him. She poured one cup, then another, slid it across the table as before. Her hands trembled, but only a little. Coulter didn't hesitate. He reached for the cup, drank, and met her eyes. It was the first time she didn't look away. In that glance, brief but steady, something shifted. The shame that had followed her like a shadow no longer seemed so heavy. Later, after he had added wood to the fire, he said in his plain, weathered tone, "This place is ours to keep, not theirs to judge." He didn't raise his voice, but the words carried more weight than any oath. May sat still, the warmth of the cup in her hands, and let the words settle into her. No promises, no grand speech, just the steady ground of someone who would not let the world's scorn decide what she was worth. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft on the roof, muting the night. Inside, the two cups on the table sent their faint trails of steam upward, side by side. The ranch had become a place where silence no longer cut. It healed. Morning broke clear after a night of snow, the land white and still, as if the world itself had drawn a deep breath. The fire in the stove had died low, but the smell of smoke lingered in the rafters, clinging like memory. Coulter rose first, as always, set the coffee pot on, and poured into 2 cups. He left one in front of the other chair, the gesture now so ordinary it didn't need words. May came from the back room slowly, still tying her shawl. She paused when she saw the second cup, steam curling upward, waiting. There was no hesitation in her hand this time. She sat, wrapped her fingers around the porcelain, and held it close. Silence spread between them, but it wasn't the brittle kind anymore. It was steady like a shared roof beam that carried weight together. Coulter lifted his own cup, then said in that plain voice of his, "No one here's got to leave if they don't want to." May's breath caught, but she didn't lower her eyes. For once her shoulders eased, dropping the burden she had carried since stepping off that train. Shame had been her constant companion. Now it seemed to loosen its grip, replaced by something she had nearly forgotten: room to stay. She didn't answer him with words. She didn't need to. The way she lifted the cup and sipped beside him was answer enough. Outside, snow blurred the old road back to town until it vanished. Inside, 2 cups steamed side by side, and for the first time in years, May felt the ground under her feet was hers to stand on. The ranch wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs. And in that quiet, in the healing hush of the West, shame finally gave way to belonging. Out here on the plains, storms pass, fences fall, and names are forgotten, but kindness leaves a mark deeper than weather or time. Her strength wasn't loud, and his change wasn't sudden, but together they built something the prairie couldn't blow away, If this story stirred something in you, share your thoughts below. And if you'd like to walk further trails with us, leave a like, subscribe, and ride along. The fire will stay lit, and there's always room by it for you.